Don't expect a share. You're just a woman, you have no right to be here. My brother's voice cut through the mahogany-paneled law office like a blade through silk, his smirk sharp enough to draw blood. The inheritance meeting had turned into a public execution, with me as the condemned. Relatives nodded their approval around that polished conference table. Wine glasses tilted in casual toasts to my humiliation. Uncle Robert actually chuckled. Aunt Margaret's eyes sparkled with the cruel satisfaction of watching someone get put in their place. But they didn't see my hands pressed against the cool leather portfolio beneath the table, fingers tracing the edges of a thin notebook that contained 30 years of receipts, bank transfers, and sacrifice they'd conveniently forgotten. If they wanted to bury me tonight in ridicule, then this was the night I'd rise from that grave with fire. My name is Olivia Walsh. I'm 35 years old, and in the house where I was born, where I took my first steps and spoke my first words, that means I'm nothing. Less than nothing, actually. I'm the family burden, the genetic disappointment, the daughter who should have been grateful for the privilege of sharing DNA with the Walsh men and keeping her mouth shut about everything else. The law office of Morrison and Associates looked like a mausoleum built for money, all dark mahogany paneling and leather-bound books that probably cost more than most people's cars. Late afternoon sun slanted through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden bars across a conference table polished to mirror brightness. The kind of room where fortunes were divided and legacies decided by people who'd never worked a day in their lives. But today, it felt more like a courtroom where I was both defendant and evidence of a crime nobody wanted to acknowledge. Father sat at the head of that massive table like a king holding his final court. Leonard Walsh, steel-gray hair combed with military precision, voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built an empire from Boston real estate and never let anyone forget it. His eyes had the calculating coldness of a man who measured human worth in profit margins and quarterly reports. Even at 78, dying of pancreatic cancer that was eating him alive from the inside, he radiated the kind of power that made grown men stutter and successful women apologize for taking up space. My brother Ethan flanked his right side like a crown prince preparing for coronation. 39 years old, Harvard MBA, custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. His cufflinks caught the afternoon light every time he gestured, which was constantly, each movement designed to remind everyone in that room exactly how successful he'd become managing other people's money. His smirk was permanent, carved into his face like scar tissue from 30 years of being told he was destined for greatness. Daniel claimed the chair to Father's left with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never doubted his own importance. My younger brother, 36 but built like a linebacker who discovered expensive suits, all bulk and bluster, his laughter always seemed to end with me as the punchline. He'd inherited Father's construction company and spent most board meetings reminding everyone that real men worked with their hands, not keyboards. The extended family filled the remaining seats like an audience gathered for entertainment they'd paid good money to see. Uncle Robert and his wife Margaret, dripping in jewelry that clinked louder than conscience every time they moved. Cousin James with his practiced lawyer's smile. Aunt Patricia examining her manicured nails like they contained the secrets of the universe. All of them bound together by Walsh blood and Walsh money, secure in their knowledge that they belonged at tables like this while I was just visiting on borrowed time. I sat in the chair closest to the door, not by choice, but because it was the only seat left when I'd arrived 20 minutes late from my shift at the hospital. Still wearing scrubs that smelled faintly of disinfectant and other people's pain, my hair pulled back in a messy bun that had started neat at 6 this morning. The contrast was intentional, I knew. Them in their designer armor, me in clothes that shouted service worker to anyone who bothered to notice. But what twisted the knife was the memory that flashed through my mind like a movie clip I couldn't turn off. I was 12 years old, standing in our family's dining room during Sunday dinner, brave enough to ask Father a question about Walsh Construction's latest project. Why don't we hire more women for the management positions? Mrs. Henderson from school says. The laughter had erupted like a gunshot. Father's voice, sharp as broken glass. Go play with dolls, Catherine. Leave business to people who understand it. 30 years later, sitting in that conference room where my future was about to be decided without my input, I realized nothing had changed. I was still the little girl who'd dared to ask questions in a room full of people who'd already decided she didn't deserve answers. But there was something they didn't know about the exile they'd created. Something that had been growing in the shadows of their dismissal for 3 decades, fed by every cruel joke, every condescending smile, Every moment they'd made me feel invisible. I'd kept records. Every single time they'd needed money, and I'd provided it. Every emergency loan, every mortgage payment, every business bailout, they'd conveniently forgotten the moment their crisis passed. The leather portfolio pressed against my thighs contained documentation that would rewrite every assumption they'd ever made about who owed what to whom in this family. Tonight, I'd learned that exile isn't absence from power. Sometimes it's presence without voice. But voices can be found, and truths, once spoken, can never be unheard. The inheritance meeting had moved from the sterile conference room to our family's oak-paneled dining room, where 3 generations of Welshmen had decided the fate of money they'd never earned and power they'd never questioned. The crystal chandelier trembled faintly above us, its prisms catching the late afternoon light and scattering rainbows across mahogany that had witnessed more family destructions than a war correspondent. The formal dinner plates had been cleared away, leaving only cut crystal tumblers filled with 30-year-old whiskey and shadows that seemed to grow longer with each cruel word. This was theater, I realized. Performance art designed to remind me exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of a family that had never seen me as anything more than an expensive mistake. Ethan raised his glass in a toast that felt like a funeral oration for my dignity. To the men who built this empire from concrete and vision, he announced, his Harvard MBA voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd inherited confidence along with his trust fund. Here, Daniel rumbled, clinking crystal against crystal, with the enthusiasm of someone celebrating a victory he hadn't earned. 30 years of sacrifice, of putting family first, of making the hard decisions that built Walsh Construction into what it is today. They traded half-truths like poker chips, each story carefully edited to remove any mention of the times I'd bailed them out, the checks I'd written, the mortgages I'd saved when their hard decisions led to financial disasters they couldn't admit to father. Leonard nodded with the satisfaction of a king watching his sons prove their worthiness to inherit his kingdom. His steel-gray eyes swept across the table, cataloging assets and liabilities, with the precision of a man who'd spent 78 years reducing human relationships to balance sheets. You boys understand what it means to carry the Walsh name, he said, his voice still carrying authority despite the cancer eating him alive. You understand that legacy isn't just money, it's responsibility. It's proving you deserve what you've been given. That's when the arrows started flying. Olivia, Ethan's voice dripped with the particular condescension reserved for family members who'd failed to meet expectations. You never belonged at this table. Not really. You were always more interested in playing nurse than building something that matters. The words landed like slaps across my face. I felt heat rise from my chest, my hands gripping the leather portfolio in my lap so tightly my knuckles went white. Don't pretend you carried anything but your emotions through this family, Daniel added, his bulk shifting in the chair as he leaned forward like a predator scenting weakness. We're the ones who sacrificed for the business. We're the ones who built this empire while you were off playing with sick people. Each syllable was a precision strike designed to remind me that 35 years of existence in this house had earned me nothing but the privilege of being tolerated at gatherings where my betters decided important things. Uncle Robert chuckled into his whiskey. Always was too soft for business, too feminine. Some people are just born to serve instead of led. I counted every heartbeat, each one daring me to break the silence I'd maintained for 35 years. The pulse in my throat hammered against my collar like a caged bird trying to escape. Every beat counting down the seconds until I either exploded or imploded. But there was something else in that dining room, something nobody else seemed to notice. A single white lily in a crystal vase at the table's edge, its petals brown at the edges, wilting from neglect. Beautiful once, probably expensive, but dying slowly because nobody had bothered to change its water or trim its stem. I stared at that dying flower and saw myself, something that had once been valued, that someone had paid money for, but was now withering away because the people responsible for its care had forgotten it existed. The truth is, Father said, his voice cutting through my thoughts like a blade through fog, some children are investments that pay dividends, and others are. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Well, others are expenses we tolerate out of obligation. The cruelty was surgical in its precision. 35 years of feeling like a burden in my own family crystallized into that single sentence, delivered with the casual authority of a man stating facts about the weather. Aunt Patricia tittered behind her manicured fingers. Oh, Leonard, you always were too honest for your own good. Honest is what this family needs, Ethan said, raising his glass again. Honest about who contributed and who just existed. About who deserves to carry on the legacy and who should be grateful for whatever scraps they're given. The leather portfolio felt warm against my thighs now, heated by my own body temperature and the rage building in my chest like steam in a pressure cooker. Inside that innocent-looking folder were 30 years of receipts, bank statements, canceled checks, and loan documents that would rewrite every assumption they'd ever made about who owed what to whom. But I wasn't ready yet. Not quite. I needed them to dig their grave a little deeper first, needed their arrogance to reach heights that would make their fall more devastating. So I sat there in silence, watching that lily wilt at the edge of the table, and let them hang themselves with their own words. Mr. Halverson cleared his throat with the nervous precision of a man who'd spent 40 years delivering news that changed lives, sometimes for better, usually for worse. His voice carried low and cautious across that oak-paneled dining room, sweat beading at his temples despite the October chill seeping through century-old windows. The lawyer's leather briefcase sat open on the mahogany table like a mouth preparing to speak truths nobody wanted to hear. Documents rustled with the whisper of paper that held the power to reshape entire family dynasties. Let's proceed with the formal reading of Leonard Walsh's last will and testament, Halverson announced, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of a grandfather clock that had witnessed 3 generations of Walsh family business. Even the dying lily seemed to hold its breath. To my son Ethan Walsh, Halverson's voice gained strength as he read from the document. I leave controlling interest in Walsh Construction, 40% of company shares, and the property holdings in downtown Boston. Applause erupted around the table like gunfire. Crystal glasses clinked in celebration. Ethan's smirk widened into something that looked like victory, his cufflinks catching chandelier light as he accepted congratulations from relatives who were already calculating how this windfall might benefit them. To my son Daniel Walsh, the lawyer continued, I leave 30% of company shares, the residential development projects in Cambridge, and full ownership of the construction equipment fleet. More applause, more toasts. Daniel's bulk shifted in his chair as he leaned back with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just won a lottery he'd always expected to win. Uncle Robert actually slapped him on the back, whiskey sloshing in glasses raised to celebrate inherited success. I sat there in my chair closest to the door, watching my brothers divide an empire built on foundations I'd helped pour. Listening to relatives toast wealth they'd never earned while treating me like furniture someone had forgotten to remove. That's when something inside me crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a thin notebook, spine frayed from years of handling, corners bent from being carried in purses and briefcases and glove compartments. The kind of ordinary composition book you'd buy at any drugstore for $2. The laughter rising around that table faltered as I slid it across the polished mahogany toward Halverson. The notebook seemed to absorb light, looking small and insignificant next to all those official documents with their embossed seals and legal ribbons. What's this? Ethan's voice carried the particular irritation of someone whose moment was being interrupted by irrelevant details. Some kind of diary? Are we supposed to care about your feelings now? Daniel's laughter boomed across the dining room. Oh, this is rich. Little Olivia brought her journal to show and tell. What's next, poetry about how misunderstood you are? But Halverson wasn't laughing. His experienced eyes had recognized something in that worn notebook, something that made his hands shake as he opened the cover. 40 years of reading legal documents had taught him to spot evidence when it appeared, no matter how humble its packaging. This island. His voice caught in his throat like he was choking on words too large to swallow. This is a financial record, detailed documentation of loans, payments, transfers. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Laughter died mid-note, like someone had unplugged a stereo. This is the record of every single debt she paid off for each of you, Halverson continued, his voice gaining the trembling authority of someone delivering a verdict that would rewrite history. Under Olivia's name, her collateral, her sacrifice, the amounts. He paused, his eyes scanning pages that contained 30 years of financial salvation nobody wanted to acknowledge. The amounts total enough to buy back this entire house, with money left over. The impact hit that dining room like a seismic shock wave rolling through expensive furniture and family mythology. Daniel's laughter stopped mid-breath, the sound cutting off so abruptly it left echoes hanging in crystal-laden air. His face went from flushed with triumph to pale as old bone, confusion replacing arrogance in real time. Ethan's whiskey glass slipped from nerveless fingers, amber liquid bleeding across mahogany like evidence of crimes finally coming to light. The sound of crystal shattering against hardwood was sharp as gunshots in that suddenly silent room. Father's steel-gray eyes blinked rapidly, his mental calculations shattering into something that looked dangerously close to fear. The man who'd built an empire from concrete and vision was watching that empire's foundation shift beneath feet that had never learned to find solid ground. Uncle Robert's mouth opened and closed without sound. Aunt Patricia's jewelry clinked nervously as her hands shook. Cousin James stared at that innocent-looking notebook like it contained nuclear launch codes. They thought truth was buried in ledgers no one cared to read, filed away in bank vaults and safety deposit boxes where inconvenient realities could gather dust alongside forgotten obligations. But tonight, truth was my sword. And I'd just drawn it from a scabbard they'd dismissed as worthless sentiment, revealing a blade sharp enough to cut through 35 years of carefully constructed lies about who owed what to whom in this family. The silence that followed wasn't just absence of sound, it was the death of everything they'd believed about power, about worth, about who deserved to sit at tables where important decisions were made. I looked around that oak-paneled dining room at faces frozen in various stages of shock and recognition, watching a family hierarchy collapse like a house built on quicksand. "Keep reading," I said quietly, my voice carrying across that devastated room with the authority of someone who'd finally learned her own power. "There's more." The silence that followed my challenge lasted exactly 7 seconds. I counted every heartbeat, before Father's voice exploded across that dining room like artillery fire. "Forgery." His steel-gray eyes blazed with the fury of someone watching his carefully constructed world crumble in real time. Lies and manipulation from a desperate woman who never learned her place. He slammed his fist against the mahogany table so hard the crystal glasses jumped, whiskey sloshing like liquid amber in the chandelier light. The man who'd built an empire from concrete and intimidation was calling in every weapon he'd ever used to crush opposition. "She's making this up," he continued, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to having his version of reality accepted without question. Desperate fabrications from someone who knows she has no legal standing, no real claim to anything in this family. But I'd been waiting 35 years for this moment, and I wasn't going to let his bluster wash away 3 decades of documented truth. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, loan documents that rustled like autumn leaves as I spread them across the polished table. Each piece of paper was a blade, each signature a wound being reopened after years of careful scabbing. "Check First National Bank," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd finally learned that facts were more powerful than fury. "Accounts ending in -1742 and -8801. Wire transfers sent at 3:12 a.m. on March 15, 2019, while you were in Milan closing the Benedetti deal." Father's face went through several shades of pale as the specific details hit him like physical blows. You can't argue with timestamps and account numbers, especially when they're printed on official bank letterhead. "Emergency payroll for Walsh Construction," I continued, pulling out more documents. 73 employees who would have lost their paychecks because your foolproof expansion plan left you $2 million short. Saved under my name, with my collateral, my perfect credit score that I'd spent 15 years building. Ethan tried to grab control of the narrative, his Harvard MBA training kicking in like muscle memory. "Even if this is true, you were just trying to get leverage over us, using our temporary difficulties to..." "To what?" I cut him off, my voice sharp enough to slice through his practiced deflection. "To make sure Maria in accounting could pay her daughter's college tuition? To keep David from losing the house he'd owned for 20 years? I pulled out more papers, copies of personal checks, mortgage payments, emergency loans that had kept the Walsh family name from becoming synonymous with bankruptcy. "You wanted leverage, Ethan? I wanted workers fed. I wanted mortgages paid. I wanted children to stay in the schools their parents sacrificed to afford." Each word was precision-guided, designed to expose the difference between someone who saw people as human beings and someone who saw them as line items on a balance sheet. "What did you want?" I asked, looking around that mahogany table at faces that had suddenly lost their confidence. "Stock options? Executive bonuses while rank-and-file employees worked unpaid overtime?" Company cars while contractors waited 6 months for payment? Daniel's bulk shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That's business, Olivia. That's how the real world works. You wouldn't understand. I understand that real leadership means taking care of people, not just profit margins, I shot back. I understand that family businesses survive when they remember that employees have families too. That's when Halverson cleared his throat again, his experienced hands finding another document in his briefcase, something that made his fingers tremble as he unfolded it. There's an addendum to Mr. Walsh's will, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to deliver a verdict that would change everything. A codicil added 6 months before his death, apparently at the request of Mrs. Walsh before she passed. The room went silent except for the soft whisper of paper being unfolded, and the grandfather clock marking time that seemed to slow like honey in winter. In her own words, Halverson began, his voice trembling with the gravity of reading messages from beyond the grave, Dorothy Walsh states, having reviewed the financial records provided by my daughter Olivia, I hereby establish the following conditions for inheritance distribution. Mother's voice seemed to fill that dining room like resurrection, speaking truths that had been buried with her 3 years ago but were now clawing their way back to the surface. No executive bonuses shall be distributed until all outstanding employee debts are cleared. A scholarship fund shall be established for children of current and former Walsh construction employees, funded by management salary deferrals. And effective immediately, Olivia Walsh assumes her rightful seat on the board of directors, with voting power equal to her brother's, non-negotiable and non-transferable. The words detonated like explosives in that crystal-laden room. I watched my brothers' faces drain of color, watched Uncle Robert's mouth fall open, watched Aunt Patricia's jewelry tremble as her hands shook. But it was Father's reaction that stopped my heart. Not anger, not rage, not the fury I'd expected from a man who'd spent 78 years being right about everything. Terror. Pure, undiluted terror, as he realized that power was slipping through fingers that had once been strong enough to crush entire industries. The empire he'd built, the legacy he'd planned, the dynasty he'd assumed would continue under his terms, all of it crumbling because the daughter he'd dismissed as worthless had turned out to be the one person who'd actually kept it standing. His steel-gray eyes met mine across that mahogany table, and for the first time in 35 years, Leonard Walsh was looking at his daughter as an equal who held all the cards he'd never known were in play. The vote is next Tuesday, I said quietly, my voice carrying across that devastated dining room with the authority of someone who'd finally claimed her rightful place. I'll be taking Mother's seat at the head of the table, the seat I should have occupied while you all played games with other people's livelihoods. The silence that followed wasn't just absence of sound, it was the birth of a new order, built on documentation instead of intimidation, on facts instead of bluster. And I was no longer the exile in my own blood. I was home. The atmosphere in that oak-paneled dining room had shifted like weather before a storm. The laughter that had filled the air 20 minutes ago was gone, vanished so completely it felt like it had never existed. Only the grandfather clock kept ticking, its steady rhythm indifferent to the family dynasty collapsing around its mahogany case, each second marking the death of assumptions that had governed the Walsh family for 3 generations. The silence was louder than their earlier mockery had been. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against hardwood with the deliberate pace of someone who'd waited 35 years to claim her rightful space in the world. Every eye in that room tracked my movement like I was a wild animal they weren't sure how to categorize, dangerous or domesticated, predator or prey. Before we continue, I said, my voice carrying across that crystal-laden room with the authority of someone who'd finally learned that power wasn't given, it was taken, let me be absolutely clear about what happens next. I pulled out one final document from my portfolio, a legal agreement I'd had drafted 6 months ago, back when I still hoped this conversation might happen with dignity instead of destruction. I will not be your shield against federal investigators. I will not silence truth to save an empire built on exploiting the people who actually do the work. I will honor Mother's will, protect the workers you've been bleeding dry, clean the books you've been cooking, and stop the financial hemorrhaging you've been ignoring while padding your own accounts. The words landed like artillery shells in that suddenly small dining room. I watched successful men who'd built their identities on being superior to everyone else, realized they'd been looking down on someone who could destroy them with spreadsheets and bank statements. These aren't requests, I continued, setting the legal document on the table next to my notebook of receipts. These are the conditions for my continued involvement with this family business. Father's steel gray eyes blazed with something that looked like desperation wrapped in fury. You can't dictate terms to us. I'm the one who kept you from bankruptcy. I cut him off, my voice sharp enough to slice through decades of practiced intimidation. I'm the one whose credit score saved your expansion plans. I'm the one who sacrificed my own financial security to keep Walsh Construction from becoming a cautionary tale in the business journals. I pointed to the first condition on my document. Father meets with federal auditors Monday morning at 9 a.m. sharp. No delays, no larger games, no mysterious scheduling conflicts. His face went through several shades of pale as the implications sank in. Leonard Walsh, who'd spent 78 years controlling every narrative, was about to face questions from people who couldn't be intimidated or bought. Ethan loses all voting rights on strategic decisions until the compliance audit is complete and every irregularity is corrected. I turned toward my older brother, watching his Harvard MBA confidence crack like cheap veneer. No more stock options awarded to yourself. No more company cars for personal use. No more expense accounts that look like vacation budgets. Ethan's mouth opened and closed without sound, his brain struggling to process a reality where his golden boy status meant nothing. And Daniel is permanently barred from the compensation committee, I continued, looking at my younger brother who'd inherited father's construction company and spent most board meetings reminding everyone that real men worked with their hands. No more voting yourself bonuses while rank-and-file employees work unpaid overtime. The conditions hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just fired. Around the table, relatives who'd been celebrating their inherited wealth 20 minutes ago were now staring at documents that could send them to federal prison. That's when Father tried one last desperate appeal to blood ties that had never protected me from his cruelty. Olivia, his voice cracked like ancient leather, smaller than I'd ever heard it, we're family. Blood is blood. You can't destroy your own people. The plea hung between us like a bridge he was begging me not to burn. For a moment, I saw him not as the man who'd terrorized my childhood with his disappointment, but as a scared, aging patriarch watching his legacy crumble in real time. But blood had never protected me from his casual cruelty, had never shielded me from his assumption that daughters were investments that rarely paid adequate dividends. DNA is biology, Dad, I said, each word precise as a surgeon's scalpel. Family is behavior. And your behavior toward me has been anything but familial for 35 years. I stepped closer to the table where that dying lily still wilted in its crystal vase, its brown-edged petals a monument to neglect disguised as care. You taught me that love was conditional on performance, that worth was measured in quarterly earnings, that women existed to serve the comfort of men who'd decided they were more important. My voice carried across that dining room with the clarity of truth finally spoken aloud. You chose to make me feel invisible. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. That's when Halverson cleared his throat one final time, reaching into his briefcase for something small and glinting. A silver pendant on a delicate chain, tarnished with age but still beautiful. Mrs. Walsh left specific instructions that this be given to you personally, Miss Walsh, he said, pressing the locket into my palm. The pendant felt warm, as if it had been waiting in some safe deposit box for 3 years, holding on to Mother's body heat until this exact moment. The clasp opened with a tiny click that sounded loud as thunder in that silent room. Inside was a folded piece of paper, no larger than a fortune cookie message, in Mother's careful handwriting. You see what others refuse to see, darling. That's not a burden, it's a superpower. Use it wisely. Love always, Mom. The words hit me like a physical force. 35 years of feeling different suddenly reframed as 35 years of being necessary. The daughter who saw around corners, who noticed dying flowers and unpaid bills and human costs that didn't show up on balance sheets. I looked around that oak-paneled dining room at faces frozen in various stages of shock and recognition, at a family that had spent decades trying to convince me I was the problem. But problems don't solve themselves. Problems don't save companies from bankruptcy or keep families from destroying each other with greed disguised as tradition. Solutions do that, and I'd finally realized that's exactly what I was. I gathered my documents with the methodical precision of someone who'd just won a war they'd been fighting their entire life. Bank statements, loan records, mother's codicil, each piece of paper, a weapon in an arsenal I'd spent 30 years building without knowing I was arming myself for this exact battle. The leather portfolio closed with a soft snap that echoed through the oak-paneled dining room like the final period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. "The board meeting is next Tuesday at 9, I said, my voice carrying across that devastated room with the authority of someone who'd finally learned that power belonged to whoever was brave enough to claim it. "I'll be sitting in Mother's chair, the chair I should have occupied while you all played games with other people's lives." I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against hardwood with the steady rhythm of someone who knew exactly where she was going for the first time in 35 years. Behind me, I left a family frozen in various stages of shock and recognition, their world reshaped by documentation they'd never bothered to request. The October night hit me like a blessing as I stepped through the front door of the house where I'd been born but never truly welcomed. Sharp air filled my lungs with the taste of freedom, cutting through the stale atmosphere of 35 years of swallowed words and accepted shame. Leaves scattered across the stone walkway like golden coins thrown by a generous universe, each one catching streetlight as it danced in the wind that promised change. The sound of my footsteps on cobblestones had transformed, no longer the tentative steps of someone apologizing for existing, but the confident stride of someone who'd finally learned her own worth. My phone buzzed against my hip as I reached the wrought iron gate that separated the Walsh family estate from the real world. Text message from Sarah in payroll, the same Sarah whose daughter I'd helped keep in college when Walsh Construction's cash flow temporarily dried up. "Miss Walsh, just got word that all employee back pay has been processed. Health insurance extended through next year. Whatever you did in that meeting tonight, thank you. You saved us again." Another buzz. This one from Marcus and the construction crew. "Olivia. Heard about the scholarship fund for workers' kids. My son can finally go to community college. You're a hero." The gears I'd set in motion with Mother's codicil were already turning, reshaping a company that had forgotten the difference between leadership and exploitation. The clauses I'd helped write into that legal document 3 years ago, back when I still hoped this family might choose love over greed, were finally bearing fruit in messages that mattered more than any stock dividend. I paused at the curb where my 15-year-old Honda sat under a street lamp, its modest silhouette dwarfed by the luxury cars that filled the circular driveway. BMW, Mercedes, Tesla, vehicles that announced their owner's success to anyone within visual range. But my car had carried me to hospital shifts at 3 in the morning, to emergency meetings with creditors who held the future of Walsh Construction in manila folders, to banks where I'd signed loan documents that kept other people's families housed and fed. It might not have been impressive, but it had been reliable, kind of like me. I looked back at the house where I'd grown up feeling like a stranger in my own DNA. Light spilled from every window, golden rectangles against red brick that had witnessed 4 generations of Walsh family business. The windows looked like eyes blinking awake, finally seeing truths that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Inside those illuminated rooms, my father was probably calculating how much this revelation would cost him in federal fines and reputation damage. My brothers were likely trying to figure out how to spin this story in a way that preserved their golden boy status. But I wasn't their problem to solve anymore, wasn't their burden to carry or their disappointment to manage. At this table tonight, they'd tried to bury me with ridicule, to inter my worth alongside assumptions they'd never bothered to question. They'd wanted me to accept exile from my own inheritance, to smile gratefully for whatever scraps they decided to throw toward the daughter who'd never learned to stay in her place. But truth doesn't rot like buried secrets. Truth digs its way to the surface, unearths what was always there, rebuilds foundations that were stronger than anyone realized. Tonight, truth had set me free. Not from responsibility. I'd gladly carry the weight of protecting workers and honoring Mother's memory, and making sure Walsh Construction became the kind of company that built communities instead of exploiting them. But free from the need to earn love that should have been unconditional. Free from the obligation to make myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. Free from the lie that my worth was determined by other people's ability to recognize it. I turned toward the streetlight glow, leaving behind the house where I'd spent 35 years trying to prove I deserved to exist. The woman walking away from that wrought iron gate wasn't the same one who'd arrived 2 hours ago clutching bank statements and hope. She was someone who understood that visibility isn't about being seen by people who've already decided you don't matter. It's about knowing you matter regardless of who's watching. I was no longer invisible in my own life. I was inevitable. The board meeting was in 6 days, and I had a company to save. Not from bankruptcy this time, but from the kind of moral poverty that comes from forgetting that businesses are built by human beings who deserve more than survival wages and deferred health care. The little girl who'd been told to go play with dolls was about to sit at the head of a boardroom table and remind everyone present that some games are worth playing. And some are worth winning. Olivia's story isn't just about inheritance disputes or family business drama. It's about the power of documentation over manipulation. It's about understanding that truth doesn't need status or connections to triumph. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it with evidence in hand. If this story reminded you of your own family dynamics, if it made you think about someone who deserves recognition they've never received, hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications because next week we're exploring another story about quiet strength and explosive revelations. Share this with someone who needs to remember that the person taking notes in the corner might be the one keeping everyone's world from falling apart. Remember, truth doesn't need permission to be powerful. It just needs someone willing to say it out loud with paperwork to back it up. Until next time, keep your receipts close and your boundaries closer.